Welcome to the latest Gramophone podcast. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and today I am delighted to be joined by Peter Whelan, the artistic director of the Irish Baroque Orchestra, to talk about his new recording on the Linn label of one of the masterpieces of all choral music, Handel's Messiah. Peter, hello.
Hello.
Now, while this is your first recording of the work, it's actually something you've lived with and the group has lived with and toured widely for many years. So before we talk about the work, tell me about your relationship to it, how that's evolved, how it continues to evolve, and why now was the moment to capture it on record.
Well, my relationship with the piece goes right back to childhood, and being an Irishman, it's the one piece of classical music and it's the one big work that we can really take some ownership of. So the premiere, of course, happened in Dublin in 1742. And even as a child in primary school, we used to have a history book, and it's this double-sided pages with various parts of history. And one page involved Handel, or just a picture of Handel with a wig on, and it said, what happened on Fishamble Street on that particular day in 1742. And that was it. And then we moved on to something else, the next part of history. But I remember that really stuck with me. And I was, starting piano lessons at the time and beginning to get interested in music and then into classical music. And it just stuck with me, that little corner of a street, which doesn't look like very much nowadays. I don't know if you've been there. And as a teenager passing by, very derelict, had been really redeveloped a lot in the 1960s and 1970s. And then just basically a little tiny empty derelict park. And I think, how is it even possible that this music could take place here? And it stayed with me throughout my adult life, like thinking about Handel coming to the city I knew so well, the city I grew up in. What was it? Why did he come there? How was it at the time? What were his connections with the city? What other music did he hear? What kind of things were going on? And of course, I was a bassoonist for a large part of my life, so maybe 20 years. And I was fortunate to travel around the world, many great artists and playing wonderful music. But there comes a point when you kind of turn back to where you're from. And for me, that was just a kind of beginning to get interested in music from Dublin around that time. And I realized if I didn't do it myself, then nobody was going to do it. So that was the impetus initially had to get into directing and conducting. So it's an important journey. So it's a long-winded way of saying that we're coming to Messiah. The route was trying to find out other composers, unknown composers within the kind of milieu of Dublin at the time. And we've worked a lot on what was going on in Dublin Castle, the different composers we were visiting. And now it's time, I think, we've circled Messiah, and it just seems this is the moment. We know enough about it. We have a good feeling for the musicians and the characters, the various characters that are involved in the first performance. And this is the moment for it to shine.
So it sounds like there's really quite personal and extraordinary resonance with it. So you talk about that first performance, and what you've done here is tried to recreate it in terms of the forces and the approach. So paint the picture of that first performance and why Handel was there. It was certainly a very triumphant visit. We hear these stories of 700 people attending, and so ladies being told to leave their hoop skirts or hoop dresses at home and gentlemen their swords. So this was a big event in Dublin life.
It was a huge event, and for Handel it was very significant as well, because he had been here in London and he had been having a terrible time. The press had turned on him, the operas were failing, he was tanking money, and his reputation was and his health was failing. And I think he had these connections between Dublin and Ireland, specifically the violinist Matthew Dubourg, who was travelling between both places, and he was the kind of Kapellmeister or master of music at Dublin Castle. And Dublin at the time was the second biggest city in the British Isles in terms of size. And it was a relatively peaceful time as well. A lot of building was going on. If you go to Dublin today, there's just, wonderful Georgian squares, which were all being laid out. Workers of various different kinds were coming from all over Europe. The stucco workers, the artists, including musical artists. So I think Handel needed an escape from London, and Matthew Dubourg and maybe similar friends were able to say, you'll have a good time in Dublin. There's money there. People are hungry for this kind of thing. And it was true. As soon as he arrived, he was wined and dined within an inch of his life. There's two reports we can rely on. One is that he was whisked off the boat he arrived on, which took a long time for him to cross the channel. But once he arrived, before his organ and his clothes could be unpacked, he was wined and dined within an inch of his life in the city. There's even a report of him having a mini stroke at the house of the Surgeon General, and he was resuscitated back to life and then never revisited that again. So I think he was having a very good time after that. Of course, he made lots of money. He was hugely successful, and we know this because he's writing letters back saying that he's having the most wonderful time. The orchestra's excellent. The new hall is wonderful. He's received by the flower of society. So it's a turning point for Handel as well. Also because I think this is the kind of the point where he's kind of definitively hinged away from opera and towards oratorio, that this is the future for him. So it seems he was very grateful, very happy with his time in Ireland, and he fully intended to come back again, but he didn't for whatever reason. It was a good moment for him, and I think he was cagey about releasing Messiah on the world. So he definitely brought it with him in his suitcase when he's coming from London. But I think we're not sure whether he was going to perform it or not. I think he was testing the water first of all. Yeah. He had these 2 subscription series which went incredibly well. I think at that point he said, "Okay, here's your gift. It's this Messiah." It's like one of the world's first charity concerts. He didn't take a fee for it, and neither did any of the musicians. Kind of like Live Aid, but back then, actually at the time, Dublin was very prosperous. Dublin is encased in something called the Pale, which goes back to Norman times. So since things are beyond the Pale, are kind of we see this more savage, but that was the traditional.
From that idiom, yeah.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, outside of the Pale, basically things were not so good. You're dealing with the kind of the colonial problems of the time, and there was a famine in the 1740s as well as in the 1840s, and a lot of the money was donated towards people suffering from this. So I guess Handel must have got a feel for what was going on politically as well. So it's a very significant piece, and I think as far as classical music works go, it's probably the work that's raised most money for charity over the centuries, basically, as well. Yeah, an extraordinary event, as you say. Fishamble Street absolutely mobbed for this new piece that was going to be performed. They had to instigate a one-way system. A pane of glass was removed for kind of an early AC or ventilation system in the new hall, brand new hall. And yeah, it was a real event. And there was scandal attached to it as well. It reminds me of like the Rite of Spring. Maybe this is conjecture, but maybe he was like an engineered scandal as well, because of course you have this religious piece performed in a very secular hall. And Dean Jonathan Swift, who's in charge of the Gentlemen of the Choirs, he really objected to his cathedral gentlemen singing there. So it was already a little bit on edge. Yeah. But also, I guess mostly is Handel's choice of singers. He had famously Susanna Cibber was in the complement of singers. And in the Dublin version, in the earliest version that we can kind of recreate, Susanna has a really central part. And she's of course escaped London from a tabloid sex scandal. She's totally disgraced. Her horrible husband has put her in this dreadful situation. I think she also escapes to Dublin, like Handel, for very different reasons. She's laying low, working in the theatres, and he notices that she's there. Maybe he already knew in advance, but he uses her in the Dublin version. She has a central aria in each of the thirds, and she's pleading her case in real time, pleading for clemency from the audience. And I think that's what a big part of the draw was for the audience at the time. He knew this. Yeah. But that's my impression. But there's there's so much going on in that particular evening. Everybody crammed into this room, this amazing composer with the new piece, all of these characters that are coming together. And yeah, we're trying to recreate some of the frisson of that experience in our recording.
Yes. No, I mean, well, let's talk about the recording. So it's on period instruments, so that's obviously an extraordinary part of trying to recreate that moment. And before we come on to talk about the singers, let's talk about the instrumentation. And this is quite a small ensemble that you've gathered, which is presumably what it would have been at the time. And in terms of looking back at the original editions, and you as conductor leading this ensemble, tell me about some of the decisions or discoveries that you've made in trying to create that sound.
We've done a lot of work on and collaborating with academics about the musicians who Handel would have had available to him. So David Hunter's done a lot of work on the size of the Irish State Music, as they were called. And then, of course, Donald Burrows and John Butt have done some great work on the number of singers that are available. So we've tried to feed this into our recording. Also, we kind of have a rough idea of the size of the theatre, and the place we found to record was roughly that size as well.
Where was it?
It was in the TU, which is the new campus of the Dublin Institute of Technology in Ireland. So it's a brand new space, but our recording engineer, Phil Hobbs, was delighted with it. And it felt, like a theatre rather than a church or a cathedral. So it added some extra immediacy or direct quality. There have been a lot of snobbery over the years that Handel didn't know what he would find in Ireland, the level of musicianship, and that he was cautious with his instrumentation, because of course it's just strings and trumpet and no wind obligatos. But we know for a fact that that's not true. From the other subscription series he had a huge amount of instruments, at his disposal. We know that Matthew Dubourg, of course, his friend, could have told him exactly the level of playing, which he was really pleased with. Yeah, we could debunk that myth, but we tried then to using those sources of information to approximate the number of musicians and singers available.
So there's an orchestra of 17 and 13 singers. And again, many listeners to this podcast will be familiar with Messiah, with big choral groups and soloists at the front, but that wasn't what it was originally. That's not how you've approached it here. And to my mind, listening to this wonderfully vivid recording, I think it gives it a sense of immediacy, almost conversational life. And there are particularly some arias like He Was Despised, where it just feels very much like someone is telling you a story in a very personal way.
Well, we were hoping to achieve exactly that there's an immediacy to that operatic element. And the storytelling and especially the He Was Despised, that immediate pleading in real time to an audience. And that's what we hoped would come across. We're, of course, really indebted, of course, to John Butt's recording, which is exactly 20 years old. I was shocked to realize that. John is a great friend and a great mentor. And of course, they covered the Dublin version exhaustively. It's a wonderful recording, and they've done every single permutation and combination on that particular one.
So they've done Eden consort and layers, and presumably that's on Linn as well. So presumably Phil Hobbs had probably worked on that. So in his mind, he probably had that same.
It's true, and it's a wonderful and very inspiring recording that the Dunedins and John Butt produced. And of course, things, as Phil was pointing out, things have moved on even in that 20 years. Things feel different, and the way we approach things feels different. And for us, it's of course intimidating having so many recordings of such a big work. But the Irish Baroque Orchestra is coming up to its 30th anniversary, and there's not many, or maybe no, Irish recorded version of this work. So, you have to just plant the flag and stake your claim at some point and say, this is what we're doing now. This is our community, and this is the way we perform it to our audiences now. And so many people, who come to our concerts say, do you have a recording? I say, actually, no. So this is, I guess, our moment to just stake our claim.
Yeah. Before we come on to talk about the Irish Baroque Orchestra's 30th anniversary, let's just talk about the singers, the soloists that you've gathered. And a wonderful lineup of people, names that will be very familiar to our readers: Helen Charleston, Alexandra Chance, Guy Cutting, many others too. So tell me about how you assemble the voices that you wanted, and then how also you use them to, again, use that wonderful word characters about the original performance. And that's something that you've been trying to create here.
Well, I was so delighted with the lineup of singers we managed to get together. They're all people who've collaborated with me or with the orchestra over the years. So there's a familiarity there, and they're very much on board with the storytelling aspect. They're all heroes because they're also singing the choruses, which is extraordinary.
So they might sort of stepping from the chorus to sing and then stepping back. And
exactly. So you have all of the characters who are singing everything and then stepping forward, so you have these individual voices. There are very many soloists in this particular version. Maybe about 9 people step out at various points.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's quite a few. Just quickly going through the characters. For our soprano soloist, we have Hilary Cronin. Absolutely wonderful. And she's singing the role of Signora Avoglio, who is the only professional Italian singer who Handel imported to Ireland. She came over on the royal yacht, so she's a very important person. Donald Burroughs has done a lot of work on her. There used to be two names associated with the soprano roles. It was a Mrs. MacLean and Signora Avoglio. And Donald Burroughs worked out they were one and the same because she had married, she had been singing at the Edinburgh Music Society and married a Mr. MacLean over there. So now they are the same person, which makes the interpretations a little bit easier. But she had come through Germany, via Russia, via Scotland. So you can only imagine what her English was like this particular person. But she was, in the traditional sense, an operatic diva voice. And she was the main soprano soloist. Interestingly, Donald Burroughs suspects that there were no boy sopranos involved because very often when you're talking, he used the word choristers to mean boy voices or children's voices. And that doesn't occur in Dublin. So it seems likely that it was a lineup of female sopranos, maybe 3 or 4, something like that. Then if you look at the alto lineup, we have, of course, Susanna Sibber, who's sung by Helen Charleston. As I described, she is the kind of slightly fallen, inverted commas, woman who's pleading her case to the audience live. There's been a lot of, at the time, criticism of her voice. She was a wonderful dramatic actress, but I think it was Bernie said that her voice was but a thread. I'm not sure also that Handel had to coach her a lot in order to, because she didn't read music, but this just cannot have been true. She's Arne's sister, and their family had an amazing musical upbringing. So I think there's a lot of slander attached to her at the time. You know, people were a little bit cagey, about this theatrical woman, and slightly nervous of her. But I think she was very gutsy and brave, and was really unafraid to kind of fight her cause. And she's doing this in real time in the Dublin version of Messiah. Then we have there's 2 cathedral altos, countertenors. So we have Alex Chance and Nate Mercheka, who are singing both of these. There's one piece written on Irish paper, which is the How Beautiful Are the Feet alto duet, which was definitely specifically written in Ireland for these voices. Again, they're not particularly angelic people. When you look into the records of the cathedral, one of the countertenors called Lamb, he was dismissed for a while for threatening to punch another countertenor during divine service. So these weren't angels by any stretch, even though they're cathedral gentlemen. Then we have it was Guy Cutting singing the tenor role, which is a really special part. And Handel writes that he's delighted with the tenor soloist he found, Mr. Bayliss. So he really entrusts a lot of the storytelling to this tenor. And then we have 2 bass soloists. So we have Ed Grint and Freddie Long. I have a feeling, looking at the score, the initial Dublin version is very bass heavy in terms of the arias that are allotted to the bass singer. And I have a feeling that this bass singer resisted Handel a lot, because some of the arias, like Why Do the Nations, is dished out to another bass. And we also see that there are many of the bass arias for the Dublin version are changed to very, very short recitatives. So I think he had his work cut out from with this one particular bass, and that maybe influenced, the shape of it for the first performance and then subsequent performances afterwards. So that's basically your lineup. All of those soloists are singing in the choir, and then step forward to make their case during the various arias.
And had you performed this live with this lineup?
Yes, we've performed this version many times before. It actually fits particularly well in the Wigmore Hall, so everybody fits on stage, and you also get that feeling of immediacy in that space. So I have a very good memories of that performance. And of course, we perform it every year in St. Patrick's Cathedral, associated with, of course, Dean Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, and most years we also go down to Wexford to perform it in the Opera House, which is a completely different feel as well, of course. Our Opera House performances are often attended by a small group of Amish people who also happen to live that part of the world, which is always amazing. They turn up with their amazing outfits with scores. It's a very important piece for them. All these young people who are like really invested in the storytelling.
But that's an interesting point in itself. That's a wonderful moment. And you alluded again earlier to the place of this work of Handel's Messiah in wider musical life. It probably is one of the most well-known, or if not the most well-known choral work that there is. The Alleluia chorus, of course, is a big part of that, but in a way that perhaps is a way in for people to explore more broadly. And I recently went to an exhibition at the Foundling Museum here, also in London, where again, the work had played a part in its charitable work, and it was exploring the place of this work of Messiah in musical life and traditions throughout society, British society, and beyond. When you perform it, are you very aware that this is, for many members of the audience, a very different experience than perhaps a Baroque opera that will attract a certain audience? Tell me about that.
It's such a well-known piece that it's intimidating in some respects, but it's also very useful from my perspective as an Irish musician. It's a piece that everybody knows, and you can draw people into the story and this amazing background of the music, and then it's very useful in a very pragmatic sense launch pad to explore other aspects of Irish music, because we often think that classical music is something that's outside of Ireland, but this story and the stories we're creating around them show that there's very much rooted, like we have our own heritage in classical music stretching well over 300 years, and something to be proud of. Like, we've contributed a lot. Of course, people are traveling to Ireland, but Ireland's also exporting lots of musicians over the years, singers, composers. John Field, you have Michael Kelly, who's singing for Mozart, and to this day. So it's just nice drawing the line back and giving, especially our Irish audiences, that sense of connection to the past. But performing the piece, again, very inspired by the historical performance practice and John Butt's approach, that we're trying to make our audiences hear it as though it were for the first time through the way we're performing it, and also just the storytelling around it. So I think that's the important thing, that people feel that they're hearing it anew. The ink is still wet on the page, basically.
Yeah. And the name of the ensemble, Irish Baroque Orchestra, perfect name to do exactly what you've described, to say actually at this period of time there was extraordinary musical life. And let's talk a little bit more broadly about the work of the ensemble, because it has been championing and acting as an advocate for composers of that time in that location.
That's right. And it's interesting to see how people are interested in our story. I think especially surprising is in Central Europe, in Germany and the Low Countries, as it were, that people are really interested to hear new things about Ireland. And of course in the States as well, where everybody stakes an Irish claim. That's always an interesting one. I do quite a lot of work in the States, and I'm starting a new job with the Philharmonia Baroque, as they say, in San Francisco, starting in a few weeks' time. But there it's very interesting to tell the story, outside of my own country, as it were. And that's fascinating too, because you find that there are maybe, older audience members who are bringing in their grandchildren and delighted that there's some Irish culture they can celebrate outside of St. Patrick's Day, and drinking lots of Guinness. And the stories are interesting. That's the fascinating thing, that there's so many of these characters who really bring the music to life. And it just doesn't end. We'll be doing a tour soon with Hugh Cutting, a wonderful countertenor, about Giusto Tenducci, this castrato who was active in Ireland and in London. It's just an incredible person, this insane story. He comes over to Dublin like Handel, but later. And he's a singing teacher for a famous lawyer, a very well-to-do lawyer. And of course he thinks he's safe entrusting his daughter with this castrato. They spend hours together talking about singing and music, and of course they fall madly in love with each other. They elope, they get married in Cork. He's thrown into jail. He's released for a night to make money at a benefit concert, and then they both escape from Ireland completely. They're next discovered in Edinburgh, and then Casanova spots them in London, and they have kids. And he's totally amazed by this. Is how did that even happen? So just a story of him, completely apart from the music. Who is this guy? What was he singing, and what was he singing in Ireland? That's, and of course then you realize that he was giving Mozart singing lessons when he was a kid. Then there's Johann Christian Bach that were friends. So there's an amazing story and musical story attached to that particular person. That's just one example. And then there's an Irish black soprano called Rachel Baptiste. We recorded a CD about her too. Amazing. She's Irish and she's black, and they say that she sang at concerts in the center of Dublin, always wearing this yellow dress. she also met that Tenducci, that castrato, who was very dismissive of her. And you see a little, perhaps for racist reasons, they have a huge tiff in the newspaper. They were singing together in Kilkenny. So we recreated that concert. But it's just very interesting to see how, there was more space in Ireland for her to be successful than there was in London. So there's just lots of cultural and musical ties and storytelling that goes together. And it just never ends. There's so much more to tell as well. But I'm just fascinated by how colourful and diverse these musicians and the musical scene was.
Yeah, and this is one of the wonderful things about music when approached in that way. It's not just taking an abstract score that happened to be written at some point. It's actually about understanding how that context really helps us understand this music and bring it to life.
I think that's the key, isn't it? That just knowing about people and people who are similar to us and having similar struggles opens the door of music to people who wouldn't maybe naturally come to classical music.
Yeah. And so what else, apart from this wonderful recording, are you going to be doing to mark the Irish Baroque Orchestra's 30th anniversary year?
Well, we're very busy. We have a quite new Bach cycle. Well, maybe we've been doing it for 3 years. So that's quite new for Irish audiences too. It's more of a regular event in the UK and mainland Europe, that you have your Bach Passions and the B minor masses and Christmas oratorio. But for us and Irish audiences, especially on historic instruments, it's kind of a new occurrence. So we're continuing that for the next couple of years at least. So we have, it's wonderful that you can kind of track clock throughout the year. Of course, at the centre are Handel performances, and we have tours to the States coming up. But it's just very nice to see, how things have grown and developed. Of course, we had a huge milestone last August. We had our first prom, where we performed Alexander's Feast, the Dublin version, of course. And that was, I think, the first prom for a group from the Republic of Ireland in about 40 years. So it was really a special event. It was great, but even just walking on stage, I think was one of the greatest moments of my life, because there was a huge swell of support as we walked on, and the few Irish flags in amongst the promenaders as well. But it felt like a rugby crowd at the big thing. So it was really, really wonderful. And of course, we were able to offer Alexander's Feast, wonderful, wonderful piece. And I've been working with Donald Burrows about the Dublin version, which Alexander's Feast is in 2 parts, and the Irish version was in 3 parts. And we managed to reconstruct this one aria that would have made it complete, which was, again, really satisfying. But yeah, so going from strength to strength, and just, again, really enjoying the storytelling and the upper trajectory. So I think this recording of Messiah is just the icing on the cake.
Yeah, there's a wonderful thing about the proms. 5,000 people in this extraordinary theatre, and yet it creates this amazing sense of community and connection. That's really wonderful to hear.
Absolutely.
So just a reminder that the superb new recording on the Linn label of Handel's Messiah, conducted by my guest today, Peter Whelan, is available now. Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for downloading this edition of the Gramophone podcast. If you've enjoyed it, we'd be hugely grateful if you could leave a rating or a review, hit the subscribe button, or simply tell your friends about our work. And if you want to explore classical music in even greater depth with Gramophone, then we produce a monthly magazine packed full of interviews, features and reviews, as well as a website with even more exciting classical coverage to explore and enjoy. And all listeners to this podcast can get a 20% discount off any subscription package by visiting gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and entering the code podcast20 at the checkout. And do join us again next week for another Gramophone podcast.